Welcome to the World Affairs Councils of America's program, Cover to Cover, our monthly author series. I'm Bill Clifford, President and CEO of WACA, and I'm delighted to present to you one of Britain's foremost journalists. His name is Philip Stevens. He's the Associate Editor of the Financial Times and Director of the Editorial Board. And as Chief Political Commentator, he writes about global and British affairs. He joined the FT in 1983 after working as a correspondent for Reuters in Brussels, and he's been the FT's economics editor, political editor, and editor of the UK edition. Philip has won the David Watt Prize for Outstanding Political Journalism and twice Political Journalist of the Year, awarded by the UK Political Studies Association and the British Press Awards. He is the author of Politics in the Pound and a biography on Tony Blair, and his new book, Britain Alone, The Path from Suez to Brexit, came out in the United States this week. It was published earlier this year in Britain. I have been enjoying a copy of it, and Philip, welcome to our program.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you to WACA for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Well, I have to ask at the outset, how is Brexit Britain doing today? And are the people that the Brexiteers claim to speak for better off?
Well, Brexit Britain, like much of the world, it has to be said, has been consumed for the last 18 months by COVID, the disruption, and in a curious way, while many of us, most of us, I think, expected a sort of a really jolting, jarring thud after Brexit, a lot of the impact, I think, has been lost in the general, the problems and the challenge of COVID. But if you're saying are policymakers and the people running the country feeling in a comfortable position post-Brexit, the answer is definitely not. And we were reminded of that only last month by the pullout from Afghanistan, where the British found themselves, if you like, trailing you Americans out of Kabul, feeling very much that we hadn't even, that we hadn't been talked to, let alone consulted about the arrangements for the withdrawal. So, what Brexit did for Britain was basically increase our dependency, if you want to call it that, on the alliance with the United States. And here we found, a few months in, or a year or so into Brexit, that maybe the US isn't always the dependable ally that we thought.
Well, you've traced through 50 or 60, 70 years the so-called special relationship and shown it to be not so special in Britain's favor many times. To what extent is the feeling likely to be different that Britain alone is more inclined perhaps to assume a junior role in what is meant to be a special partnership?
I think that's so. I mean, to be clear, I think the transatlantic alliance, let's call it that rather than the special relationship, has been really important to Britain, and I think important to the US. I think we have, through decades been very strong and important partners. The problem is that we've always rather romanticized it and thought about it as Churchill called it, the special relationship, and invested quite a lot emotionally in the relationship. And I think for the US, Britain's been a valuable partner, but a valuable partner in pursuit of American interests. And every now and then we get a jolt when we're reminded that you're the big power and we're the small power. And that's in a way the story that I try to bring out in the book, that the problem that Britain has had in adjusting over 70 years or so to the fact that though we're still a significant power in the world, we're no longer at the very top table, as it were. We're I would say a great nation, but no longer a great power.
It seemed that so many of the post-war prime ministers really looked at the alliance with the United States and the relationship with what has become the European Union as a choice, tilt either clearly in one direction or the other. Tony Blair, who you wrote a biography of, appeared to be of a newer generation and seemed to get the balance for the first time right, that it could be both. Why was that balance so elusive to the other prime ministers?
Well, it's always been, since we joined the European, as it was then, the European Economic Community in 1973, there's always been this pretty awkward balancing act. We had built this security, foreign affairs partnership with the US after Suez, after learning perhaps that we weren't quite the imperial power we imagined. We always, I think, have regarded ourselves as sort of slightly above the rest of Europe. I think, again, a historical legacy. We weren't invaded during the Second World War. We saw ourselves as the winner of the Second World War. So trying to adjust to the idea that we were just another big European power has been hard. We did adjust, but as you say, it was always awkward. I mean, one prime minister, Edward Heath, did actually lean towards Europe, and in fact, so lean towards Europe that Richard Nixon, as I say in the book, at one point cut off the intelligence cooperation between London and Washington. But most of the time, Britain has thought, well, look, the limelight, being in the limelight, being with the US president has always reflected power, prestige that you get from that, more important than being a player in Europe. Blair, as you say, got it right, and he got it right in the sense that we should have been able to be both. And the power, the influence we had in Brussels, we should have been able to leverage in Washington, and vice versa, that the influence that we might have in Washington would be good in our dealings with Brussels. Blair got it right until the Iraq War intervened, and then he had to make a choice because France and Germany were against the war from the outset, and he chose Washington. And so what could have been, I think, a much more robust foreign policy based on both the European pillar and the Atlantic pillar didn't happen. And then what Brexit did was it basically blew up the European pillar of our foreign policy. So we now have only the American pillar. And this at a time, and this is our real problem now, when the US is turning away from Europe because of the preoccupation, perfectly understandably, with the rise of China.
And as you say, the international context is quite different now. I have a question from Carol in Worcester, who is asking about the worldwide movement that she sees toward populism and extreme right-wing politics in Turkey, the Philippines, Brazil, parts of the United States. To what extent is what's going on in the UK part of that, and where does it lead? What is likely to change?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Brexit was part of the sort of populist upsurge, the populist reaction, I think initially to the global financial crash, then to austerity policies, and to the perceived, if you like, inequalities that globalization had brought to many Western societies. So I would put Brexit in that category, and we saw You've seen populist movements across Europe, both of left and right. And Brexit attracted a group of people who thought they had been, and I think with some justification, they'd been disenfranchised in terms economically and politically. They were the left behinds. Brexit was a revolt. And I think, you know, Joe Biden referred to Boris Johnson as a, you know, as a sort of mini-me Donald Trump. I don't think he was entirely wrong.
Well, talk about Boris Johnson. You know, given that Brexit was fueled by this anti-elitism and the anti-globalization feelings among part of the Conservative Party, he's projecting now global Britain. It seems a paradox. And to what extent does he have the freedom to maneuver internationally that Brexit as an emancipatory action was supposed to produce?
Well, I mean, I'm afraid to say, and I wish I didn't have to say this, because as I said, I think Britain still has lots of strengths, but, you know, global Britain is really, you know, is a slogan without substance. It's the aim, as you say, is to project the idea that, you know, free of Europe, we can go and, you know, back across the globe, and almost in a sort of Elizabethan way, we can reconquer the world, as in the 17th century. But, you know, the reality of British foreign policy, again, over the past 70 years has been that our aspirations have run ahead of our capacity, our military capacity, but above all, our economic capacity. You know, we've sent an aircraft carrier to the South China Sea, and this is, you know, said to be an example of, you know, Britain, you know, global Britain again. The problem is we'll send it once, but we won't be able to afford to do it again. We won't be able to keep ships there. So, in fact, global Britain really means a Britain more closely attached to the United States, and perhaps to other English-speaking countries like Australia and New Zealand. From my perspective, I've never quite understood why we couldn't be a European power and have global interests and global influence, if that's what you want. But the Brexiteers seem, you know, have made it a choice. You know, either you're global or you're European, and I think that's a completely false choice, as I say in the book.
I wonder what you think of what is the perception in London, in the UK writ large now of the United States under Joe Biden. After Donald Trump and America First, and he's still very much in our political mindset and context, is there trust in the notion that Biden is presenting in America is back?
Well, there was, I would say, but I would say, you know, and this is across the political spectrum, I would say there's pretty universal dismay about the way the withdrawal from Afghanistan was conducted. Now, on a substantive level, it was clear to the Europeans that the president, he said it before the election, he said it at the G7 meeting in June, the president was set on bringing American troops home, and it was accepted that, you know, this is a decision that the US obviously, you know, could fairly take. What I think caused huge upset and not a little anger among British politicians and policymakers was we weren't really consulted to any extent about the manner of the withdrawal, how it was going to be done. For example, you know, the closure of Bagram, but the Bagram base, which changed the military dynamics completely. We were just told about that rather than asked about that. So there was a sense that, you know, Britain had put a lot into Afghanistan. It had been the biggest contributor of troops, apart from the US. We lost 457 of our armed forces in that fight. And we thought, well, I think, and, widely shared view, at least we could have been consulted on the way we got out.
No question about that. It seemed very chaotic to us in general, and I'm sure Britain is not the only ally that feels that.
To pick up your point again, though, but just to say that more generally, the reassurance that Biden has given about the US commitment to NATO, which was, a commitment that Donald Trump openly questioned, strategically, that's still very important. Afghanistan has been a problem and an episode, but a United States that seems to have renewed its commitment to NATO as the core of, Atlantic defense is very important. So I think I should make that point as well.
I want to get at recent Tory thinking in this way that picks up on the wonderful history that you've written, Philip. Harold Macmillan and his administration produced the Future Policy Study at the start of the 1960s. And Sir Nicholas Henderson, as you know, delivered a valedictory paper at the conclusion of his ambassadorship to Paris in 1979, titled Britain's Decline, Its Causes and Consequences. And these were essentially, as I take it, audits of British power and assets and potential leadership influence in the world. Did David Cameron, or has Boris Johnson and his cabinet, had they produced any similar strategic kind of assessment of Britain's place in the world and how it may exercise power?
Well, in name, yes. In substance, I'm sad to say no. I mean, David Cameron had a strategic review, military and foreign policy review, which turned out to be really an exercise in budget cut, in cutting budgets, and we had a big retrenchment of the armed forces. More recently, in fact, only a few months ago, Boris Johnson's government produced what's called the Strategic Review, which was billed as setting out what global Britain actually meant and where we sat in this new world. What it was, it's very well-written document, and it was a very good description of the world as it's becoming, the shift from the post-Cold War order to a world of great power competition, particularly dominated by the competition between the US and China. And it talked a lot about the need to move into cyber and to get ahead with technology, all reasonable things. What it didn't say is how Britain intends to prioritize its effort. Where is Britain going to put its resources, its energy, its money, if you like? Where is Britain? Who's Britain going to work with? Of course, it reaffirms the alliance with the US, but many of our security threats are shared with the rest of Europe. Look at Russia, look at, for example, the threat from terrorism in the Middle East, look at uncontrolled migration. These are threats that we share with France and Germany and Italy. The problem is the document, basically, because of Brexit, doesn't say anything about how we're going to cooperate with these countries post-Brexit.
Are there any countries that you feel are taking Boris Johnson very seriously?
Sad to say not. I mean, Boris Johnson doesn't have a record of sticking, I was going to say, to his principles, or sticking to his policies. And, you know, we're in the midst now of
perhaps even truth.
Perhaps even truth. And we're in the midst of a huge argument with our erstwhile partners in the European Union about the nature of our agreement, particularly our Brexit agreement, particularly as it pertains to Ireland. And frankly, the Prime Minister is trying to renege on a deal that he did with Ireland and the rest of the EU. One of the reasons his relationship with Joe Biden is so bad is that Biden feels strongly that Britain should keep to that agreement. And personally, I think rightly so. You know, there isn't a, how do I put this? There isn't a seriousness about Johnson and foreign policy that you expect from the leader of, you know, a pretty significant nation. I would argue there is, again, a bit of a parallel with your former President Donald Trump.
Yes. I have a number of questions coming in as a result of your remarks. Philip, this one from, let's take this first. Yash Paul asks, do you think it's possible for any country to have a special relationship with USA or China or Russia for any significant time?
I think it is possible to have a special relationship. And look, you know, if you're British, you know, the values we share, the interests we share with the US, but also with other European countries, the defense of the open liberal system, and the US remains the most important defender of those freedoms, as it were. So of course we need a very close relationship. I think the problem arises when we claim it's a relationship that's sort of somehow more special than the relationships that other people can have. You know, I would say we should always have a, wherever possible, a strong relationship with the United States. But let's not pretend that it's something that it isn't. And let's not pretend it's stronger than Germany's relationship, or stronger than France's relationship, or stronger than, you know, Japan's relationship. This is where I think we've rather, Macmillan had this phrase, which was it was a clever phrase, but it was one that we should act as if we were the wise, as Greeks to America's Rome. And the implication was that we would be the wise counselors whispering in the ear of not so sophisticated Americans about, you know, how to run the world, as it were. That's, you know, there's still an element of that in British thinking, which is it's frankly silly.
Although perhaps most successfully managed by Margaret Thatcher with Ronald Reagan, I suppose, if any.
In part, I think the partnership between Thatcher and Reagan was really important in the last stages of the Cold War, in the sense that, you know, she was the stalwart who helped Reagan, but other Europeans, to stiffen the sinews of those who didn't want short, medium-range missiles in Europe to counter the threat from the new Soviet missiles. So the fact that she was ready to hang so tough. But, you know, let's think about how special that was. When Ronald Reagan went to speak to Gorbachev and to talk about getting rid of all nuclear weapons, and that would have included, incidentally, the British deterrent, he didn't talk to Margaret Thatcher in advance of that discussion. He didn't call up and say, you know, Maggie, you know, is it okay if I put your Trident or then Polaris missiles in the pot for a deal with Gorbachev? Equally, when Reagan decided that, you know, he needed to invade Grenada, which is Commonwealth state, Queen, the head of state there, he did call up Maggie, but only as the Marines were already going in. So it was close, but not. It was a relationship that had its bumps as well.
Yeah, and the U.S. was much more lukewarm than even France with respect to the Falklands early on.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it, but in a way, you could say, look, that was a good, healthy relationship because the two leaders were together when they really needed to be. But there was room in the relationship for disagreement, you know, legitimate argument, disagreement. I mean, I would say it was a bit one-sided, America one tilted towards the US, but you know, in a sense, that's how a relationship between allies should be, that, you know, when it counts, you're together, but you don't have to agree on everything.
One thing I learned from your chapter, Cold Warrior, on Margaret Thatcher was really at the end when she was also quite close to Gorbachev, and that elevated the prestige of her leadership and Britain as a whole, was that she really became, for all her strengths, a prisoner, if you will, in what was, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Germany's reunification frightened her almost as much as, you know, Reagan's willingness to give up, you know, nukes if he could negotiate that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was actually, you know, I went through, you know, hundreds, maybe dozens of documents in the archives, and the document that really shocked me was an account written by in fact, the Soviet Russian of this meeting where Thatcher, just before the Berlin Wall fell, Thatcher said, look, we're against united Germany, and it will disrupt and challenge the post-war order in Europe. And so I want to assure you, Mr. Gorbachev, that we will not do anything to break up the Warsaw Pact or to precipitate, as she called it, the decommunization of Eastern Europe. Now, here was a prime minister who had said, look, we want a Europe, you know, free from the Atlantic to the Urals, basically sitting down this private meeting. And I was so shocked. I went to see, and as I said in the book, I went to see Charles Pole, who was her foreign policy advisor, and sat in on that very meeting. It was just the two leaders and the two advisors. And he said to me, yeah, the note is an accurate description of what happened. And I think she was of that generation who couldn't accept that Germany had fundamentally changed. And so she looked at the horizon, saw united Germany emerging again as the most powerful European nation. And in her bones, as it were, she thought that would be, and it became, sadly, as she got older, it became almost an obsession that, you know, Germany will, you know, rise again. And you see, there's an element of that you still see on the, you know, on the right of the Conservative Party and the Brexiteers who talk about the European Union as a sort of German takeover of the rest of Europe and things. But that was a really shocking moment, I think.
It was. Now we have elections in Germany that are spelling the end of the Merkel era. I wonder how you see leadership in Europe and the European project, if you will, going forward with a new German leadership. Does Macron stand as really the central person, as I'm sure he wants to be, the standard bearer for liberal multilateralism? What do you see happening on the continent?
Well, I think, you know, we don't know that the result of the German election is going to be, is very difficult to predict. I mean, there's been a shock that the the centre-left Social Democratic Party, which had looked to be, almost, dying on its feet, has sort of sprung back, and its candidate, Olaf Scholz, looks like the most likely winner. But the strange thing is, though he's centre-left, he's in the present coalition, and he's presented himself as the continuity candidate for Angela Merkel, and rather successfully. I think, and I've just been writing for the Financial Times about this, I think the problem we have in Europe now with, for all her qualities, Merkel was a leader who wasn't ready to confront the responsibilities that Germany now has, as a country that profits mightily from the liberal open order, but doesn't really contribute to the defense of that order to any degree. I hope Germany will get a leader who, in its next leader, will find someone who wants to do more with Macron to develop European capabilities. And when, I think when we talk about Europe developing its own defense and other capabilities, it shouldn't be seen as in opposition to the US. It should be seen as, look, the US has other things to do in other parts of the world. So we Europeans should, for example, be prepared to do more in Africa, in trying to stabilize some of these countries in Africa, where Islamist extremism is rising again. We should be contributing more to stabilizing and our own backyard. Merkel, I think, she got the rhetoric, but she never really persuaded the Germans to move in that direction. I just hope the next leader does.
Do you think that any British leader is going to be able to persuade a divided British public to have that kind of engagement with, on defense and security?
I think what's going to happen is, in Britain, is look, our economic logic, nearly half our trade is done with Europe. Security, foreign policy, defense logic, as I said earlier, these are common threats that we all face from, whether it's from Russia or from terrorism or from uncontrolled migration. So at some point, Britain is going to have to realize that we may not have to join the EU again, but we're going to have to rebuild our relationships with the rest of Europe. Frankly, Boris Johnson isn't going to be the prime minister that does that. But we will get the next prime minister, and it doesn't, whether conservative or Labour or whatever, realities, economic and geopolitical realities will reimpose themselves, unless we want to, pull up the drawbridge and,
truly shrink
our island. And, we can't afford to do that. We're a trading nation and we're an internationalist nation. So, yeah, we'll be back in Europe, but it's going to take a few years. I mean, the sadness is, I think, these things, as we've seen in the past, it takes us a few years to realize when we've gone wrong and move back to a more pragmatic course. But I'm hoping.
Intriguingly, I mean, the day after the referendum, or maybe it was 2 days after, Cameron resigns, and Johnson himself seemed shocked, saddened, surprised. It wasn't supposed to be a win to actually.
I think
leave.
Johnson, look, the thing that to know about Boris Johnson, and I've known him personally actually for, since he was a journalist for 25 years, many of us have. The thing that's important for Boris Johnson, really important, is Boris Johnson. And his leadership of the Brexit campaign was as much about his positioning himself as a future leader of the Conservative Party and future Prime Minister, as it was about high principles about British sovereignty. The principles came later. The self-interest, the ambition came first. Then all the stuff about sovereignty and things was layered onto it.
Nancy Hamlin in Rochester, New York, poses this. Many British people say that if the referendum were held today, the vote would be reversed. Do you agree? Do you see a possibility for a referendum that would move Britain toward a new kind of engagement with Europe in an official or a structured way, let's say?
I mean, to be honest, I mean, I would like a referendum today and I'd like it to be reversed. To be honest, though, I'm not sure it would be, because I think when voters take a decision like that, a big decision, the idea that politicians come back a few years later and say, you know, there, we think you got it wrong. Can you change your minds, please? Might encourage quite a few people to say, actually, no, we're not going to change. So as I say, I think the idea within, say, the next 10 years of us going along and saying we'd like to rejoin the EU is probably not going to happen unless there is some great shock. But I do see us, once this prime minister is gone, going back to our European partners and saying, look, can we find new ways now, you know, outside, you know, different from the ones before, of tightening our cooperation? Can we turn this trade agreement we've got now into something more? You know, can we think of some joint projects, you know, particularly between the French and the British, that we might be doing, you know, in the Indian Ocean or in Africa? So yes, we're going to get back closer to Europe. No, I think, you know, certainly within the next 5 to 10 years, I don't see another referendum.
Was there ever a hope, an expectation, or a desire among Brexiteers that other countries that had membership in the EU would leave as well?
Yeah, there was. And, you know, a lot of I think even an expectation among some of the more strident, you know, a lot of their argument was that this is an unsustainable enterprise. You know, it's trying to suffocate the nation state. You know, it's trying to build, as some of them would say, this German-dominated confederation. The fact that no other nation has sought to leave, the fact that Europe has actually, if anything, moved on and integrated a bit further post-COVID with this, you know, huge reconstruction fund, is a source of great angst among the Brexiteers, I think, because they're sitting there saying, well, you know, why isn't it breaking up? And it's not. I mean, I say this as someone who believes that the EU is a very imperfect organization. I'm not a European federalist or anything like that, but it is, you know, as a way of organizing a lot of middle-ranking countries in a way that they can project their power and influence collectively, it seems to me the obvious thing to do.
I have 3 questions that touch on the same thing, which is further disunion, but within the United Kingdom. And Edward Martin's in Boston, Mary, whose surname I don't know, in San Diego, and Ronan O'Malley in Houston are asking about the possibility that Scotland would become independent, or that questions about Brexit in Northern Ireland, whether it would change the relationship there with Ireland or with the UK.
Well, I think what one can say is absolutely true is that what Brexit has done is loosened the bonds of the United Kingdom Union. And it's done that for 2 reasons. In the case of Scotland, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, while England voted by a smaller margin to to leave. The Scottish people feel disenfranchised. They wanted to be part, as they voted in 2014, to remain part of the United Kingdom. But the deal then was that they'd also remain part of the European Union. Now, a lot of Scots say, well, look, it's now a choice. Do we remain with England within the UK Union and outside Europe, or do we leave England and go into Europe? And the balance has certainly swung towards the nationalists. The polling suggests that if you had another referendum about now, it would be very close, but the nationalists might just shade it. My own view is that that position is likely to harden over the next few years. So if I'm wrong about the next UK government moving back and trying to re-establish a close relationship with Europe, if we still have a bad relationship with the rest of Europe in 3 or 4 years' time, then Scotland's going to vote for independence. With Ireland, it's different. There is this very complicated question about the border and the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. But what it's certainly done, Brexit has certainly done, it's made, Ireland is, the Republic of Ireland is prospering mightily in the EU, had a very difficult time during the financial crash, but bounced back, is doing well. Northern Ireland still depends very heavily on funding from the UK Exchequer, economically not so well, but trade between the two halves of Ireland is increasing. What Brexit will do, I think, is accelerate that. There's a demographic shift towards nationalism as well in Northern Ireland. And I think above all, psychologically, Brexit has just put the question on the table. Well, maybe we're having all these changes, maybe we should think about United Ireland. So I don't think that, we're going to have a referendum in the north or the south of Ireland in the next 5 years saying, let's have a United Ireland. But a question I think that was very much in the background has moved into the foreground and, move out a little bit, 10, 15, 20 years, and you now begin to see, the real possibility of Ireland uniting. So again, one of the tragedies of Brexit may well be that it results in the breakup of the United Kingdom.
I want to pick up, thank you for that. I want to pick up on the word psychologically. And, what struck me reading through prime minister after prime minister and those that felt impelled to deepen engagement with the European community, European Union, and with a single currency perhaps, and all that debate. The emotion is just palpable off your pages. And I, as an American, think of British people as being relatively unsentimental, relatively unemotional. But there is so much in the psychology of what you've been writing about. And so this brings me to, a sense of what is a normal nation. I spent a lot of time in Japan where, the Constitution renounces war. Their defense is heavily reliant on the United States. Now they have a neighbor, and there's a debate of constitutional revision happening in that country and whether they should have weaponry to be able to counteract not just China, but North Korea. Could Britain and its sense of national prestige and its seat at the great tables of multilateral diplomacy or bilateral diplomacy ever think to become a normal nation without nuclear weapons now? It costs so much. You could do so much more for your people economically, and even for other areas of defense that you mentioned, cyber, Navy, or what have you, without the missiles. What is the prospect of that? How tied up is it in prestige?
Well, at the moment, no senior politician of either party will admit, that there should even be a question about, whether we have a nuclear capability or not, because it's become such a sort of emblem of national prestige. We're a member of the P5, and the Security Council, and the P4 have nuclear weapons. How, horror of horror, if we gave up our nuclear weapons, France would still have its nuclear weapons. And if you understand the rivalry between Britain and France through centuries, the idea for a lot of people. So that's at a sort of slightly trivial level. But I would argue, and this is, there's going to be a reckoning. After Suez, after the debacle of Suez, people in the UK had to step back and say, look, and this is where you mentioned the future policy study 4 years after Suez, where people stood back and said, let's do a sort of balance sheet of where we are and what we can do and what we can't. And I think that, it's going to take a while, but, and again, it's going to take a new prime minister at least. Someone is going to do this reckoning. And I agree with you, if you do that reckoning honestly, you say Britain still has a lot to contribute to the sort of security, diplomatic, intelligence, and military fronts. But the fact that we have 4 submarines, prowling the Atlantic with missiles that aren't even targeted on anything at huge expense, is this a sensible way to spend the money? Or would we be better in this very uncertain world developing, having a better, stronger surface navy able to operate in more trouble spots around the world, to complement other nations in their endeavors, including the United States? I think, but we've got to get out of this psychological prison, I call it in the book, which Macmillan set up, that once you've got a nuclear weapon, how can you give it up? And I think you talk to serious strategists in, say, the military of defense here. They would never say this, in public. They'll say to you privately, look, if we didn't have nuclear weapons today, we wouldn't dream of building them. So at some point, we're going to have that grown up, difficult recognition that there are better ways for Britain to make its voice heard in the world than with Trident nuclear missiles.
Let's talk about some other nuclear powers. How does Whitehall assess Russia these days? And a question from Rex Holmlin is, the Russian security services have conducted several very public operations in the UK. What does Britain feel is the right policy toward Russia?
I think Britain feels, and rightly so, that the right policy is a very tough policy. I think there was a recognition that President Biden's meeting with Putin was useful, because you have to talk to your adversaries. It's no use. Diplomacy is about not dealing with your friends so much as about dealing with, your rivals and adversaries. I think there is a view that we shouldn't shut down our relationship with Russia. But I think there is a view that we should be pretty unforgiving. We have moved. I mean, London has for too long been a sort of base for Russians to launder their money, and indeed for some of them to launder their reputations. We have, I think, rightly moved. We're moving away from that. We haven't fixed it yet, but we're getting better at that. I think diplomatically, we're tough. We're out there on sanctions policy. But the problem is now, outside the EU, it's just us. When we were in the EU, and this happened after Ukraine, and I reported on this at the time, we were at the front of those in the EU saying, let's have some tough sanctions. We wrote the first sanctions list, and we brought others on board. And so there was a really successful episode in British diplomacy. Now we can say what we want to say, and we can operate our own. But what France or what Germany or what Italy or Greece or anyone else does, that's completely outside our orbit now. So there's a classic example about how leaving the EU has actually weakened our position vis-a-vis Russia, because Russia can, if we impose sanctions on Russia, that'll hurt a little bit. If we get the rest of the EU to impose sanctions on Russia, that hurts quite a lot. So we haven't had, the discussions about Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, which Angela Merkel had with Joe Biden. Before we were involved in all those discussions, we were just sort of watching them on the sidelines. So, but yeah, we have a pretty robust policy, and I would say rightly so.
And how about China? How do you see Britain navigating certainly the US-China rift, but also on its own? And I'd like to have you speak to the reversal on the Huawei build out of Britain's 5G cell phone network in that regard.
Okay. Well, on China, we don't really have if one reads the strategic review, we don't really have, it's a sort of, it's a fence-sitting exercise at the moment. What we have done under David Cameron, his government, we had this, I think, pretty strange policy of basically everything is driven by the economics. We want China to invest lots in Britain. We want London to be the financial center for renminbi transactions. So we'll just be nice to China. And it was basically whatever you want. When Cameron left and was replaced by then Theresa May, she took a much more strategic and security-based view and began rolling back. And under pressure then, from very strong pressure from Donald Trump, Boris Johnson moved further and scrapped the Huawei deal effectively. But we still haven't worked out, how do we, the trick for a country like Britain in this is to say, how do we set ourselves firmly alongside the US in defense of, democracy, in defense of the rule of law, and pushing back against China's attempt to undermine its neighbors in the South China Sea. How do we do that while at the same time maintaining a reasonably balanced economic relationship with China? And we haven't worked that out. So we sort of swing a bit. We basically, I think in substance, are basically with the US, but then rhetorically, we like to sound a bit nicer to the Chinese.
Looking ahead to the domestic political world that you cover so well and closely, is it going to be for Britain coming out of COVID, the economy stupid kind of argument at this point? What do you see the strategy there?
Well, we have, like as the US and most other countries now, this huge public spending and debt overhang. You know, the government's thrown everything at COVID, and rightly so, and keeping businesses alive. But that's left a big overhang. We have a demographic profile where all the pressure on public spending is upwards. You know, elderly people needing more health care, more personal care, and whatever. So, and we've had, only this week, the government's announced the new tax to pay for health and welfare care for the elderly. And Boris Johnson has found himself really strongly attacked from the right of the political spectrum for being a high tax conservative, and people have been reviving George W. Bush's read my lips, no new taxes, because Johnson promised not to put up taxes in his manifesto. He's now done so. So I think the big area of political domestic debate in Britain over the next 2 or 3 years is, how do you balance all these pressures for more spending, particularly on health and welfare, elderly people, with the fact that the tax rates now are as high as they've ever been in the post-war period, and we have 100% of our GDP in debt. That's where the real, so it is the economy stupid. And then equally at the same time, how do we cope with the fact that our businesses now find it a lot harder to sell into Europe? Because although there are tariffs, there's huge amounts of paperwork now. If I send a package to a friend in Italy, now I have to fill out customs declaration.
I imagine that the purported efforts to strike up all these bilateral free trade agreements is not going to get done quick enough, or maybe even thoroughly enough to alleviate that pain.
No, you know, look, it's great to have a free trade agreement with Australia, but I guess Australia accounts for, I don't know, 1 or 2% of our trade. You know, the US is a different matter, but I don't think we're going to have a free trade agreement anytime soon. And even then it will be difficult because of agricultural products. So, you know, we have a difficult few years ahead. And I think in a way, the only good thing to say about that is that maybe that will accelerate that process where we sort of come to our senses again about where we sit in the world and the sort of relationships we need with our neighbors.
Angela Weck, just to close, two points, one from a colleague and one from me. Angela Weck in Peoria says, it is the search for identity by the British going to become an attempt to relive the glory days of the past, perhaps not empire, but at least as a global power, a pivotal power, in the words of Tony Blair. Do you see that impulse?
Yeah, I mean, and that in a way is the whole, is sort of the book. And, you know, Brexit is an exercise in a way in nostalgia. We're trying to reclaim the past, and it's going to fail. So yes, I see it, but no, it's not going to work. We're not going to reclaim a global role because it's not there for us to take anymore.
The Irish columnist Fenton O'Toole wrote on the eve of the official exit of the EU, while Johnson likes to talk of this pivotal moment in our national story, there is neither a settled nation nor a shared story. And that quote was captured also in a New Yorker article that said, what we can expect perhaps of Britain, now of Brexit Britain is more welcoming to foreign capital, but less welcoming to foreign people, greener and more conservative, freer, but weaker. Would you accept those analyses?
Yeah, I'm not, I'd accept most of those. I'm not quite sure why we'll be freer outside Europe, but yeah, there is this irony in striving for this identity, as I think the Fintan O'Toole quote puts it. We have actually exposed the fact that we don't have. I'd say that Brexit is an English project, not a British project, and that's the real problem. That's the problem for Scotland. That's the problem for Northern Ireland. The problem for us as we're not a nation state. We're a state of nations, as it were. And this was the English part of the union speaking. And reclaiming, if you like, their identity, but at the expense of others.
Philip Stevens writes for the Financial Times, has done so for decades. I felt that in reading your book, Britain Alone, it traced a good bit of my lifetime, although I don't go as far back to Suez or even to barely Harold Macmillan. But Philip, it's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. I wish you much success with your book. If you come to the United States when you're allowed to do so after the pandemic, we'd love to host you in person.
I will definitely do that. And thank you so much for hosting me today. It's been a great conversation, Bill. I've really enjoyed it, and the questions from those listening in. Thank you.